Welcome. I'm so glad that you're here. So this is a series that we have been doing now for 2 years. And at the Dittrich Museum, if you don't know where that is, we're at the corner of Adelbert and Euclid. And we kind of look like Severance Hall Light, sort of. Bit imposing on the outside, but we're very friendly inside. We have about 175,000 artifacts of the medical past. They're not all on display, because that's a lot. We're on the third floor, partly on the second floor, and we continue to creep in that way. Basically, what we wanted to do is we wanted to have experiences with the public and not just be a destination. And part of that is hearing from you. And so we wanted to have a series of conversations where we're inviting you to talk to us and to each other. So while I'm going to start off by giving us a 15-minute presentation or so, about the medical past, and tonight we're going to be talking about industrial damages, essentially the kinds of problems that we have had in the past in terms of public health, the industrialization of this town, and then rising from the ashes, where we go from here, where we might go in the future. Hopefully, did all of you manage to get upstairs and see the exhibit? Good, good. That's a really interesting point of departure, I think, and after I give my talk, we're going to bring up a panel up here, and we're going to talk a little bit about public health in Cleveland. We're going to talk a little bit about the immersion experience upstairs. So, I will just get us started. I also want to thank, this is both partly due to the Baker Nord Center, they support us, and so does the Cleveland Medical Library Association, and they are partly what runs the Allen Memorial Medical Library here on campus, of which we are part. So, without further ado, Smog. I like this image. I think that it's both beautiful and evocative, and also tells us quite a bit about the kinds of damages that industry can do. I think this is something that's on a lot of people's minds since November 8th, probably. So this is about lead poisoning's long legacy, but it's also about other aspects of industrial decay and about public health measures here in Cleveland. So some interesting things about Cleveland. It's a city story. The story of the way public health, human beings, and industry come together is very much a story about Cleveland, but it also describes places like Detroit and Chicago and Pittsburgh. Essentially, we started off, people were here, it's about 1810, but there were 4,000 people making up Cleveland in 1836. By the end of the Civil War, there were 90,000 people. By 1930, there were 900,000 people in Cleveland. That's not a lot of time, and that's a lot of expansion of population. Now, why is that? Well, there were jobs. And those jobs came from things like new industries, new infrastructure. They had to build things. I kind of love these old pictures, don't you? Wonderful old cars. And of course, we're a steel town too, so the auto industry is very important. Our wonderful bridge up there. And all of this was turning us into a really special kind of place. There were big exhibitions happening here. And Cleveland, you see these posters, you think about it, we were like one of the top 5 largest cities in the nation. 900,000 people, business expositions. It was an exciting place to be. But this rapid population growth, I mean, it comes with a downside, doesn't it? People started pouring into this country, and particularly going to the job centers. So if you're one of the top 5 largest cities, that means you're going to get a lot of immigrants coming to your town looking for work. And that's good. And it's bad, and it causes all kinds of problems. So the interesting thing to note about Cleveland is that clashes between different cultures happened early on in our history, but it was not actually between black and white. That happened after the 1950s. Before that, it was Eastern Europeans largely coming over. And there's interesting health consequences of that, because many of them brought their own health practitioners. They brought their own midwives. They brought their own caregivers. But those caregivers weren't licensed in this country. And so you started having effects of that, where people in the medical field here in Cleveland didn't want to share space with midwives or other practitioners that were from other countries. So all of that's happening in the mix of large industrial growth, and there's a lot of needs. we need to have safe places to work and safe water. So the biggest concerns end up being poisons of various sorts, largely carried by water, epidemics that were carried by water. And in addition to that, an understanding that workplaces themselves could be incredibly dangerous. I'm right now studying 19th century anarchists in a book I'm writing, and one of the key things that they complain about is just how often things blew up. The 19th century, like, boiler explosion was one of the key ways that you lost your lives. But in addition, there was like the Pemberton Mill collapse, which is a case where new people bought the mill. They thought, well, if this many machines and this many people produce this much product, then twice as many machines and twice as many people, right? That's good. They didn't check the structure for how much the building could handle. They doubled the size of the staff and the machines, and the entire mill collapsed. It trapped 600 people in it and then caught fire. So, these are the kinds of things that were aggravating the situation. People were worried, people were scared, but people still needed jobs. So some of the hazards. Lead poisoning. That one is, it's interesting. Lead was in a lot of materials. Paint, for instance, but that's not all. Pipes, like the ones that bring water into your house. Other problems, radiation. Did you know that there was an X-ray company here in Cleveland? The Engeln X-ray company. And in fact, one of the first martyrs of radiology is buried in Lakeview Cemetery. His name was Dudley Wick. They didn't know radiology was dangerous. Dudley proved it in the worst possible way. He was the assistant to Dayton C. Miller, who helped install the pipe organ in Severance Hall. So it's kind of interesting. We have these iconic places, these cultural meccas in some way, that have these ties back to industry and the problems of industry. Industrial calamities, we've got plenty of those in the burning river town. Fire, burns, dismemberment, people breathing in dust that was dangerous for lung maladies, causing bronchitis that could lead to cancers and other kinds of problems. Are you aware of the Cleveland Clinic fire? Anyone? Okay, well, early Cleveland Clinic, Kryl and his partners, they stored X-ray film. So back to X-ray again. And that X-ray film was unstable, and it caught fire. That in itself was not necessarily the largest problem, though. The largest problem was they had done something good. They had put in a new ventilation system. Unfortunately, the ventilation system took the poisonous gases all through the hospital. And so more people died from the poisonous gases than died from the fire. One of them was one of the founders, and Phillips, and he actually went home knowing that he was basically had a limited amount of time to live. So he went home, spoke to his family, put his affairs in order, and died, I think, the next day. Radium Girls, these are interesting. If you're not familiar, we thought radiation was good for you because we figured it comes from the sun. The sun's good, so you should drink radium water because it's so good for you. And it's not. So the Radium Girls were painting, using paints to put on clock dials so they would glow in the dark, as irradiated things tend to do. And the brushes were very small, and the numbers are very small. Anybody paint much? We're in an art gallery, of course. What happens if you paint with a brush a lot, put much pressure on it? So, we need to get that fine point again, but it's got radiation on it. And they started developing teeth that glowed in the dark. They thought it was cool, so they painted their teeth with it, because that was neat. And they painted their lips with it and other things, and then slowly received cancers that rotted away their teeth, gums, and parts of their jaws over time. And so ghost women await court decision. By the time it went to court, most of the girls had died or were so ill that they couldn't appear in court. And we have precedent for that right now, after 9/11. For instance, many of the people who were first responders and suffered, now that it's time to renew those suits, there's only, I think, 2 of them left. So this is something that we've seen before, but it starts off being something no one understood. Of course, we understand it now. Incidentally, you use lead to box that up. The Cleveland disaster. I do love looking through old newspaper photos. They make sure to render it in such detail. What the Cleveland disaster actually comes down to is it was an explosion, it was a gas explosion, the LNG facility in 1941, and it's still called the Cleveland disaster. In 1944, the holding tanks failed, and they released their contents into the streets and sewers, and the vaporous cloud itself caught fire. And you can see it almost looks like bombs have been dropped, doesn't it? It almost looks like that might be a World War II photo or something. That's a lot of damage. Those are bricks on the street there. Lots of injured, lots of wounded. Luckily, not as many people died as you might think, but the destruction was incredibly powerful and also very, very expensive to fix. But the thing I partly wanted to talk about tonight is something that I think still faces us today as a city and many other industrial cities, and was brought to the fore of our attention with Flint, Michigan. And that is lead poisoning. This is not a very nice image. We have several of these over at the Dittrich Museum in our public health display. And essentially, lead's a strange compound. It builds up in your system slowly. And what started to happen is you would begin to collect lead in the lining of your gums, around your teeth, in your lips, and in other parts of your body as well. You would find that it collected under the fingernails. It would show up in other, if you x-rayed someone, you would see that lead was sort of leaching into their body. But the lips and the teeth, that was particularly evident. And it led to other kinds of problems. For instance, not only were you potentially getting lead in your workplace, but you were going home and water was coming into your house potentially with lead pipes. You might be cooking with lead utensils. They just didn't understand how dangerous it was. These are immigrant families, often many of them living in the same small apartments. And the health was just not good. They didn't have, again, remember I said they were discouraged from using their own health practitioners, but that doesn't mean that they had immediate access to health practitioners of other sorts. So that meant people got sick, children got sick, lead paint. Lead paint's an interesting story. So you know about lead paint, right? Do you know why people liked lead paint? It's durable. It's amazingly durable. And painters, house painters, were really unhappy when the government suddenly came down and said, you can't use that anymore. But by the way, the lead story doesn't actually end until like 1977, when lead paint is finally completely banned. But lead, it starts off, this is literally just a bucket of lead. The buckets aren't very big. We have this bucket at the Dittrich. They can't be very big because lead's really heavy. But this white lead, it's soft, and you would mix color into it, and you could paint things with it. And we have a big company right here in Cleveland, who is Sherwin-Williams. They caught fire a lot in the 19th century, by the way. We've got some good footage of that at the museum, too. You have to sell this lead paint to people, though. And McDonald's has figured this out, actually. If you want to sell something to parents, who do you go after? The children. That's right. Lead paint made coloring books for children, saying all about how wonderful lead is and how lead has come to the rescue to save us from a colorless life. And the front cover, actually, of I don't think I have it on here, but in the museum, the front cover of the coloring book is a child riding a horse that's basically a big piece of lead with hooves. And so he's just like, yay, lead, it's so great. So literally the people who are at most risk from lead were the very ones who were technically being marketed to by lead. So I think that's fascinating. You should really, If you're doing a research project or you're interested in seeing this more, we have these coloring books at the Dittrich Museum, and they're pretty fantastic. So they understood that certain things were dangerous, and there were health measures. But the health measures tended not to be cures. They tended to just kind of mitigate or soften what was already happening to you. Lead is it affects you neurologically. And people used to get drop wrist, so that meant like you lost the ability to control the muscles that help you hold your hand upright. And the only thing they could do for you was to create a brace that you could put underneath your wrist so that you could continue working on the assembly lines. So again, it's a really interesting dynamic because these very things that were making people sick were also allowing them to feed their families and to build our city. And so I think sometimes it's easy to paint with a broad brush. Sorry for the pun. It's easy to kind of say, oh, it's all terrible. But in fact, our rise as an industrial city and the ability to to become a center for people, a population center, is intricately linked to some of these dangerous things. Now, that's kind of okay if you know that you're being transparent, but that's not always happening. We want to protect our water, isn't that right? Most people know that the river caught on fire. That's what that picture is up there. And in Cleveland, if they give you lemons, you make lemonade. If you burn the river, you make burning river ale. So we know how to rise from the ashes in many ways. But the important thing is, no one wanted to stop polluting because it was expedient and cheap. And what we were dumping into the lake and the river was actually raw sewage to begin with. So cholera, originally people thought cholera traveled in the air. It doesn't. It travels in the water. We had huge cholera outbreaks here in Cleveland. Polio is also something that's frequently transmitted around water and gets worse in the summer. So it became an increasingly bitter struggle. And the public health departments were new. They were kind of like sanitary policemen. And all they could do was fight the filth. That's all. They didn't have a lot of power. They become more powerful with each epidemic, for obvious reasons, in Cleveland. But in addition to that, they managed to come up with one very big solution. This is actually called it's the Kirtland intake. Does anybody know what that is? The Kirtland crib. That, if you ever look way out on Lake Erie, you'll see this red thing. It's always in one spot. That's the water intake for Cleveland. It's 5 miles out. They realized that if they were dumping raw sewage on the shore, that they could go 5 miles out and pick up clean water and pump it into the city for drinking water. Again, our solutions were a little soft. But this became a really important thing because it led to some other important developments in health. You want to build a tunnel 5 miles out in Lake Erie. Where is that tunnel located? Yeah, it's under a lot of water. It's under a lot of pressure. How are you going to build it? Well, you have to pump all the water out of whatever the caissons, they were called caissons, the big concrete pylons that you were working in so that you could build the tunnel. And people would come up from there and get violently ill. And they called it caissons disease. Does anybody want to guess what it actually was? It was the bends. It was the bends. So they were getting nitrogen because they were going from high pressure to low pressure suddenly. So a gentleman by the name of J.R.R. McLeod, if that sounds familiar to you, it should, began researching here in Cleveland on pressurization sickness. We have one of his tiny pressure chambers in the museum, and he put frogs and things in it to test the effects of high pressure, low pressure, to figure out what was actually happening inside people's bodies. The reason you might recognize his name is because he goes on to leave Western Reserve and go to Toronto, where his lab discovers insulin. So it's interesting how, if he's studying metabolism, the kinds of things that ultimately happen. And if you come to the Dittrich, we have an exhibit by Eli Lilly showing you how a pig's pancreas it's interesting stuff. It's wrapped in ribbon. I didn't know what it was. I was like, what is this? And my boss was like, it's a pig's pancreas wrapped in ribbon. Of course. The other interesting thing, this is about the kinds of techniques and the laboratory work that goes in to testing water quality so that we end up with safe drinking water. And another side note, just to show you that all things are actually connected, and the ends of all these wheel spokes go back to the district, says me. The forensics toxicology expert, John George Spencer here in Cleveland, also tested the water quality and spent the latter part of his career trying to figure out how to make the rivers safer places and how to fix the problem of people absorbing these things through the skin. So we want to work towards change. We have the water intake. Oh, one other thing, the tunnel collapsed at one point leading out to the intake, and it caught fire and other things, and they needed to rescue people. And Garrett Morgan prototyped one of the first respirators, and they used it to rescue people. Garrett Morgan was a black man here in Cleveland who also made us the first city with traffic lights. Yeah, that's handy. People were working towards change. They wanted things to get better. The Willard Storage Battery Company, for instance, they were really trying to change things. They added really strange things like windows and ventilation, things that we take for granted today, but that didn't necessarily exist inside of factories or even inside of hospitals on occasion. And in speaking of hospitals, Lakeside Hospital changed the way they were built. They decided maybe you didn't want your patients to be stuffed up in rooms, but you'd give them some sort of air circulation. And so they built these awnings so that people could go out and take sunshine and air. They started the Visiting Nurses Association. They would go out to these poor families and they would start administering care. So the public health organization in Cleveland that started off just being kind of a filth policeman, a sanitary policeman, becomes actually a group that administers programs here in Cleveland. They also begin to test for lead and lead poisoning. So this is going on actually much earlier than you might think, which I think goes to show that the participation of civic and social reformers really accelerated rapidly in the early part of the 20th century. And it led to things like school hygiene. Oops, I guess I don't have that one. School hygiene as well. Education programs and settlement houses. I forgot to include them, but we have some great photos at the district of they would go into the schools to do health, weight, measurement, glucose testing, eye tests. They would, I mean, I think they still do a lot of these things now, but there was a time when there was nowhere where all the children would get that kind of care. The additional thing is they would teach children about hygiene. This is actually how it was done in Britain as well. How you make change, you educate young people, and the young people take that information home. And so a lot of the ideas about health and hygiene start there. But that doesn't mean that the problems come to a complete end. As most of you know, the problems we had with the river, we began that cleanup process, I think, in the 70s, and it's still ongoing. I mean, they're still talking, we're dealing with whether or not we dredge, how we dredge, how we get rid of these problems, how you treat it. It's a really important feature of any city, and Cleveland has the opportunity to be a model for a sustaining city, because we are a post-industrial city that's trying to come back, that's rising up from the ashes and saying, you know, we matter, we want to build communities that are healthy and strong, but it doesn't actually come from the top down nearly so often as it comes from the bottom up. And so conversations like this are really, really important. So I'm going to put some questions up here behind me, and then I'm going to invite my panelists up. And we're gonna just do a quick briefing, a little talk, but more specifically, I want you all to be thinking, because the best part of this event is the part where you take part in what I like to call the roundtable session, where you get to ask your questions, where you get to talk about the things that concern you. And this is just, in my opinion, the most vital part of community and community health. So please, a round of applause for our panelists who are gonna come up here. So Megan's actually, she's a curator here at MoCA, and she's a marvelous human being who's going to be telling us, who's going to be telling us a little bit about the exhibit upstairs and how that relates to what we're talking about today. We have Merrill, I'm always doing it wrong. Merrill Gordon, like Meryl Streep, who's going to be telling us a little bit about public health here in Cleveland. And we have Scott Frank, who joined us at our last conversations, if you were at that one, and who's also going to talk about public health. He's the director of the program. And so I think that this is a wonderful set of people. I'm going to let them introduce themselves more fully so they can express to you why they're here and what they do. And then we're going to talk a little bit and then bring it back to you. Megan?
Good evening, everyone. Let's do call and response. Good evening, everyone. Wonderful. Let's get our blood running. As Brandy said, my name is Megan Rich. I'm the deputy director here at MoCA, and I also organize exhibitions. And I'm the curator of the exhibition Anders Ruwald, Unit 1, 3583 Du Bois, because it's in Detroit, and they don't say anything with a French accent. This exhibition is a really important one for our museum. It's the first time that we've really turned over that space to a fully immersive installation. Anders is a Denmark-born and Detroit-based artist who teaches at Cranbrook. He's their chair of ceramics. And in 2014, he came to Detroit in 2009 from London. In 2014, he purchased a building close to the Eastern Market, near the old Black Bottom neighborhood in urban Detroit, in a landscape that's pretty raised and quite green because most of the buildings have been destroyed. The few that remain around this abandoned apartment building are abandoned themselves. Many of them are have caught fire. And he was interested in creating a new space, a permanent installation that reflected on the city of Detroit, which has become his home, and on the cycles of the histories of Detroit, the transformations that have happened over the course of, let's say, the last century or so. So the installation that he's making in Detroit in this apartment building is piloted upstairs in the exhibition. And so 5 of the rooms upstairs will be 5 of the permanent rooms in the apartment of Unit 1 in the space in Detroit. And the medium that he's working with mostly is fire. And all of the materials that he uses are in some way impacted by fire, but many of them also relate to the discussion today. So if you've seen the installation, or if you go up after the talk, one room is entirely covered in pet coke, which is an oil refinery byproduct that covers the entire surface of the bathroom, including the sink, the tub, the mirror, the walls, the ceiling, the light fixture, the floor, in an almost like Pompeian ash appearance. Several octagonal rooms are lined in lead. The floors are entirely steel. And then there are ceramic objects that he has created along with found objects in the space, all of which are mostly black. So while it's not necessarily a negative portrayal of Detroit, it is a dramatic reflection on its history and the way in which some of these materials and the industrialism of that city has influenced its cycles of sort of triumph and failure. So that's me.
Thank you so much. That's great. Merrill?
Thank you. Thank you both for having us here today, and thank you all for joining us. My name is Merrill Gordon, and for the last 4 months, I've been in the position of the director of the Cleveland Department of Public Health. I've spent most of my career actually working in public health and community development, and I always think things like this just sort of, think everything happens for a reason. But in college, I studied the origins of public housing and spent probably a good portion of a year looking up all these microfiche debates that happened in Congress back in the turn of the last century around affordable housing and poverty and the tenement houses and the suffragists, actually, who were very much involved with this issue and with the settlement houses and really moving towards providing safe, affordable housing for families, especially related to public health. And it was just very, very interesting to look at the debates back and forth on them and so many of the things that you talked about here today. A couple of things that sort of resonated with me. We were talking about the radium. We just had the Ohio EPA coming into town about 2 weeks ago because they did a study of some of the old sites here in Cleveland where this product was made and used. And the other thing that they used it for in World War II was they painted the belt buckles of the soldiers and also something on their helmet so that they could see them at night. And so as these soldiers were taking their belt buckles on and off and sort of immersed in the chipping of that paint was impacting them as well. Obviously your questions, lead is first and foremost in my mind. If you read the Cleveland Plain Dealer, this has been a big series in the last year, but even when I worked at the city the last time, lead was a huge issue. Lead continues to arise. When I had to do a big presentation on the presence of lead, and some of the things that were just sort of startling to me, the old TV sets that we used to have with the big back on them, those have between 5 and 10 pounds of lead in each and every one of them. And so as we all got rid of them and went to flat screen TVs, which also have lead in them, mind you, so do your cell phones. The screen has lead in it, so it's protecting you from the radiation behind it. And today when I got a few x-rays at my dentist and they put this big lead apron on me, I was just sort of sitting there like, how poetic this is happening today. But anyway, so we got rid of our TVs by putting them in landfills and crushing them. And so all that dust of lead just kind of continues to circulate and eventually leach out of the soil and become part of our lives again. It's interesting that lead is a presence all around the world, and you're talking about 1978 when lead paint became illegal in the United States. Doesn't mean other things don't have lead that you might be touching. Maybe the plates that you'll be using over Thanksgiving that you take out of your cabinet and only use once a year, a lot of those are painted with lead and have lead in them. And a lot of things are still imported that have lead in them, and that's a huge issue for us, especially really cheap things. I'm old enough to know that that toy that we used to have, my brother and I used to pull at the Stretch, I don't remember, it was Stretch something.
Stretch Gordon, which is really funny.
Maybe it was Stretch Gordon. Maybe that's why we had the toy. But to make it that flexible, it had lead in it, and when it sat for a long time and then collected dust and ended up not being quite as flexible, that's lead coming out of those toys. But we were looking at Japan, and Japan has a huge issue with lead, but not as much poisoning with their children, and one of the reasons they believe is because they take their shoes off before they enter the house. So they're not tracking that into the home the same way as we do here. So in terms of public health and all of this, we could talk forever about it. But I think about sometimes when I actually have time to clean my house and I do some dusting and I just look at what comes through the windows of my home, it really is startling. And so really kind of knowing that keeping your house clean is very important for health reasons as well. And it's one of the key messages that we try to tell families, because that's something you might not be thinking about, how it's not just all in the paint, it's in so many other things as well. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Scott?
Yeah, lead is actually never in the paint if it's dangerous. If it's dangerous, it's dust. It's dust that comes from the paint, but it is the dust that causes the lead poisoning. I'm Scott Frank. Hi. Nice to be here with you this evening. I am a family physician. I am the director of the Master of Public Health program here at Case Western Reserve University, and I'm director of the Shaker Heights Health Department. I have a couple of comments that I'd like to make based on the other comments made this evening. The first is my tour of the exhibit. I loved it and was reminded of a quote from a very recent study done by one of our MPH students looking at the concept of precision medicine, which many believe is the future of medicine in the US. But what he did was interview public health professionals about their thoughts about how precision medicine would fit in a population kind of setting. And one of the quotes that he got from one of the participants was that it was like going into a house that had been destroyed and changing the light bulbs. And the only thing that worked up there were the light bulbs. I think we have a long way to go to know exactly how advances in technology can affect where we live, which is where health occurs. Home is where the health is. So the second comment that I would make is based on a comment that Brandy made, and that is that nothing is dangerous until we prove that it is. And then a decade later, we have the children believing that it is, and a decade later, we have the parents believing that it is, and often a lifetime later, we still have consequences of that danger and the disbelief. I remember probably having just jumped off my bike with lead paint or riding my bike with lead paint behind a broadcast pesticide truck going through our neighborhood spraying pesticides, which we now know are harmful both to humans and profoundly to the environment. And that would have been leaving the house where my father was smoking. It is amazing that we're alive. The legacy of these dangers is profound, and the legacy of these dangers really represents a social justice issue. There's no question that we can and have fixed the lead problems in most neighborhoods in the United States, but not in certain census tracts and neighborhoods of Cleveland, where the lead levels in children are more than 25%. I will say, and we really need to acknowledge this, that lead levels nationally are about 1/10 in children of what they were in the 1970s, when many people in the room were children. It has improved, but the only safe lead level is 0. Lead is always a neurotoxin. It is a toxicant of the worst kind, in that it does have lifelong repercussions, and it has repercussions on both the way we think and the way we respond to stresses. And we tend to, those who have suffered from lead poisoning, tend to respond in a more antisocial way, in a more violent way, because that's the way their brain is now wired as a result of their lead poisoning. So it is a true social justice issue, and one that we have made progress on, but we haven't really made progress until we make that same level of progress in all of the neighborhoods in Cleveland.
Thank you so much. Okay, guys, it is now your turn. So you've gotten a sense of who we are and what kinds of information we can offer you and bring to this discussion. But what I'm really interested in knowing is how you personally feel about it. And we have some questions up here just to kind of get us started, but I'm sure there's lots of other things, especially in the news. We have the Dakota pipeline, the access pipeline, and water quality. We've got the fact that there's racial disparities in terms of where lead poisoning levels tend to be. So I'd like to open the floor. We've got some mics, and we want to hear your questions of our panelists, or it doesn't have to be a question, it can be a comment. And I want you to be able to talk to each other as well. So who would like to start us off and get us rolling here this evening? Okay, Deidre?
This is just a quick one. When you were saying that the platters that you use like once a year may have lead in them, how would you know?
How would you know?
That is a good question. Some of these, depending on when it was actually made and where it was made, there are a number of plates that we know that were made in Mexico. Those were all painted with lead paint. The thing to be concerned about is if there's chips in it. If you see any chipping around the actual platter or whatever the vessel is, we would encourage you not to use that plate, or to make sure that there is a liner on it underneath for the food. But it's the same thing with a variety of things that we see that are imported here in cooking utensils that could be used with lead. A lot of this stuff doesn't require being disclosed. That's the other thing that we're very, very concerned about. But many of these things, I know that the china that my grandmother had, that my sister now owns, is we know that was made with lead paint. Just because of the history of what we knew about it, but we would just encourage you to be very cautious of making sure that if the food is touching it, if it's super hot food on that surface as well, we would encourage you to put a liner underneath it.
Great.
I would just add to that it's not necessarily the old things that have lead paint in them, because we have a whole new generation of immigrants who've brought things with them when they have come to the United States. And interestingly, China is one of those main sources of high lead containing artifacts and knickknacks, bric-a-brac, plates and so forth that people bring with them from their homeland that continue to poison them when they come to this country.
Okay, other questions or comments? Thoughts about lead, about other kinds of water quality issues or social issues as well? Yeah, I'm close, I'll give it to you.
Okay, thank you. So much of the success we've had about combating industrial damages and lead in particular has come from federal law. It's come from the Clean Water Act and other federal acts. So if the federal laws were to be weakened, let's just come up with a crazy hypothetical. Let's say some new president comes in who says that they're going to stop and completely dissolve the Environmental Protection Agency. What can local governments do and other people do to prevent these damages from happening in the future? Can we somehow replace that role at the, let's say, state or local level? Yeah, I'll stop it there.
That's a great question, and I'm going to actually turn this over to our panel for answers, but I would just start off by saying that I think we're always better off when we're working in our own communities to try and build health. I think that's almost always the right place for it to start, or at least to grow. So did you want to take a stab at that one?
Well, I'll say this. I was in a meeting this morning with, we have 3 divisions in the Department of Public Health. We have air quality, the environment, and health. And this morning I was with the air quality folks, and we have a couple industrial entities in the city of Cleveland that are actually applying to pollute more, which is something they are allowed to do. They have to demonstrate what they're polluting more and perhaps pay a little bit more, but the EPA has set things up so that it is not necessarily that they are belting out only good stuff. It's very complicated, and sometimes you just sort of scratch your head of what we're actually doing. But I think, as was just stated, it's so important for people to get involved. We're actually trying to coalesce a group around one industrial site because the owners are just not taking any responsibility, and they're just dragging things out in the courts for years and years. I think we're almost in year 20 at this point for one of these places. But we talked specifically this morning too about thinking about our strategy with the new administration, what this is going to mean. I didn't pay as much attention as I probably should have during the election of what he was saying, because that was not necessarily my candidate. But we did hear him saying, just wiping out specific things from the federal government's perspective. But it's really important to make sure that our local legislators know that we still care about these issues and how important they are, because they also have to act on our behalf.
Policy always has a disproportionate effect on public health when compared to other approaches, so you're absolutely right that there's a risk happening here. In most cases, the local level has the capacity to pass laws that are stricter than state or federal. There are some areas where there are preemptions, where the state forbids, or the federal government forbids, local entities from having stricter regulations, but in most cases you're able to have stricter regulation. But in that case you're often viewed as anti-business in your efforts to promote safety and protect the public, and you risk businesses not locating in your area. So it is a dilemma. It will be a dilemma. Let me make it entirely clear. It's a dilemma now, and it may become an exaggerated dilemma as we move forward. You've correctly identified an issue that we are going to have to keep a close eye on.
Yeah, and were there hands up over here? Because I'm really excited to hear from some of our young people, too. Okay, we'll do you next.
When an industrial site is identified and it's deemed, hey, we have to clean it up. So you've got all these poisons and pollutants and big one, lead. It goes from point A to point B, and I can't imagine it's all incinerated, because if it's incinerated, then it goes in the air. So do we just move it from one place to another and just contain it? And what happens to it then?
So what happens to lead after, like, if we identify it, what do we do with it? Yeah, it's a good question.
It's kind of hard to hear.
So we know, let's say we know there's lead, the TVs you were talking about throwing out,
yes.
right? So we've got them, great. Then what? What do we do with them?
Well, they've been put in many of our landfills, and they've been crushed. We have, in the city of Cleveland, we had a number of smelting facilities that had a tremendous amount of lead. And through the federal EPA guidelines to close those sites down, there's a certain amount of capping that takes place. So yes, it is essentially contained. It's closed, it's capped, it's tested on occasion to see whether or not there's any leaching. But lead is an element that never ever goes away. I mean, it's not like we can take this stuff and ship it to the moon or drop it to the bottom of the ocean, although there's a fair amount of that goes on, because as there's water runoff and things and all this dust does get down into our catch basins and back out to our lake. But this is a perpetual thing. We're creating so much of it. I mean, lead is it's absolutely everywhere. I think sometimes too, you're just talking about this, what is the future generation going to do with all of this, all these bottles? Like the millions and millions and millions of bottles that we are creating, and we aren't recycling all of them. And even if we are recycling, there's carcinogens that comes out of that too. So, but right now the solution is to essentially contain it, put as much of it together and contain it. But for that which is in our landfills, from everything else, from all those toys, from everything else, it's packed in certain ways, but it's not leaching out, and what we test for are things like methane and things that are belted up into the air and not necessarily just through the ground.
Lead is a natural element, so it's always existed, and it's what we do with the lead that creates the problem, not the lead itself. So if it's put in one place and if it is contained, it's less of a risk until they build the next suburb on top of it.
Right.
That was my main question.
Yeah.
When an industrial site is converted into, when an industrial site is converted into something else, you're saying it's encapsulated, which is great, but then that top layer eventually gets removed, and then it exposes the poisons underneath. So I wondered if there was a system set up where it actually gets shipped.
There's an imperfect system set up to try to protect us from that, yes. Yeah.
Imperfect.
Some have been
I think
capped
imperfect is
with, there's a certain amount of capping that needs to take place, and you can't just go in and dig and decide to put a new house there, perhaps. But some of them, oddly enough, have become parks and green space and places that children play. What we have done, because we've really been talking a lot about this at the City of Cleveland, is we'll be going out and testing a lot of these areas again, even though the EPA may have said, hey, you're good to go, we're fine from our perspective and moving on.
Right. I think that's a good plan.
Yeah.
So we haven't addressed one primary source of lead that policy eliminated essentially, and that is leaded gas.
Right, that's true. That's
along
true.
roads and highways, the exhaust from cars settled on the soil and created much of the lead poisoning that happens. So back to your point on policy, these policy changes really drive the decrease in lead poisoning that we've seen over time.
Great. So I know we had a question over here, and I think this is great because, of course, you young folks are going to be inheriting all of this. So it's good. I'd like to hear from you.
Great. So sorry, that's loud. Something that particularly struck me, you guys spoke a little bit about how when you were growing up, some concerns that you didn't realize were concerns at the time in regards to pesticides, smoking. Now, looking back, hindsight, it's easy to identify that these are issues, but do you guys have any suspicions or identified any areas in which you think that as our generation grows up, we're going to look back? Yeah, definitely. That's kind of my main
Social
point.
media.
You said that lead was in cell phones. Do you think
Snapchat.
that? Yeah, yeah.
Do not take naked selfies, please.
That might be another conversation, but
That's a different self-ownership
yeah,
than I was
exactly.
thinking
I'm not
of.
sure.
That's a public health message.
This is a really great question because, I mean, this is a perfect opportunity to talk about the fact that you don't know something's dangerous until you know it's dangerous. There's a few things that we suspect, right? That too much time on the cell phone, too much screen time, too much of us doing, like our heads are all we're gonna evolve strangely, is gonna happen. The problem, I think the real answer to your question is, we have not yet identified some of the things that are probably dangerous. And those are kind of the scary ones. Nobody knew that lead was dangerous for you. People didn't realize the full ramifications of what we were doing to our water systems. So there's probably things that we can't even know about yet.
Right, but there are some things that, I was speaking about this the other day about obesity and sort of thinking how interesting it is that plates at this point, kind of going back to cookware, plates have gotten so big because portions have gotten so big, and you go to restaurants and what have you, and so much food at this point is processed food, and you can get just about, I don't really ever walk down the frozen food section of the grocery store, but I find it so fascinating when I do. I'm like, you don't need to go to the produce section. Like, everything is frozen and put together or in a can or something like that. And you think about kind of how we've evolved to that. And I think that it's so important to know what's healthy and what's not. I'm not a meat eater, but when I look at how meat is produced and what kind of the things that they're given to animals and chickens and so on just to produce this food for us. I mean, thinking about what's going into it, how unnatural things are anymore. I think that that's so important when you see how much processed food is given to children. You see these young children or mothers putting soda into bottles. I mean, just things like that are just, none of that can be good. So I think about how all of that has an impact. Seriously, thinking about really what we're putting into the ground every day. I mean, I just think it's so terrific when people have started to become conscious of this and recycling and so on, but we should have less things to recycle. We should be really kind of knowing what we're using and how much of this is impacting us. And how we've gone to a point where everything is so cheap. So we know what these factories are like overseas and what kind of pollutants are really killing our fellow human beings in other countries just so we can buy a $5 t-shirt at the Gap. I think stuff like that is really important to think about.
I want to give two examples at the opposite end of the spectrum about how science is affecting the question that you've asked. On the one hand, we have good science that discovered pretty quickly, and policy was put into place pretty quickly, that BPAs in plastic water bottles were dangerous to health. And now you would have to work to find plastic that you consume things from that have BPAs in them. Good science. But on the other end of the spectrum, bad science that will be a threat to you and your future is antibiotic resistance and the increasing overuse of antibiotics, the increasing power of the antibiotics that create the resistant bugs. So science is at both ends of that spectrum of what you don't have to worry about and what you do have to worry about as young people today.
Right, that's excellent. And actually, this is true of medicine as well. Cleveland gets credit for inventing baby formula, which is, right, yay us, except the first baby formula was actually corn syrup, flour, and sugar. So not so yay us. So science is only as good as the research that's being done at the time, and sometimes we unfairly castigate history when in fact they were doing the best they could, but we hope that your generation will know much more than our generation, and that the generation after you will know even more. Some more questions, comments? Yeah.
I have a question. Sorry. We sort of addressed issues where we're talking about, everyone turn around, sorry. So we're addressing, it seems to be obvious, these sort of like toxins. We're saying industry is an issue. We've talked about the idea of like, you were talking about cost on all those various things that like, if we're talking about our food supply, we want cheap food. So we can identify the issues, and it doesn't seem like science actually, it seems like rational thought and science actually can produce to show us what's going to be problematic. Like we know plastic is a problem, we know antibiotics is a problem, we know that lead is a problem, but there seems to be a disconnect on how you get from industry, which isn't necessarily isn't sitting at the whims of the populace, and then there's a populace who either doesn't have the time or doesn't have the capacity to care or spend more money in order to evade those things. And so it seems like there's a giant gulf there. Sort of like what we're talking about here are the problems, and we're saying we should do less, but just saying doing less doesn't seem like a real solution, considering that people aren't really being given options to do something else because of the industrial chain.
That's a great question, and I'm gonna have our panelists address it. But first, I just wondered, did anyone else have a comment that had to do with this issue? Because the same thing is true when I gave the talk on diabetes at the Global Center not too long ago, which is that it's fine to tell people to eat more healthy, but if you can't afford more healthy food, if you can buy ramen and it's cheap and you can get it and you can be full and you can feed your children, why are you going to go and spend twice that much to feed fewer people on good food, but yet, you understand. So did anyone else have a comment or question or point about that before, so we can kind of cover it all together? Yeah.
Sorry. I was just kind of curious as to how much of that, and I guess the awareness of all this comes down to education. Like, yeah, you're going to go out and like buy ramen for like $1 or like whatever, but do people understand or even know that there are healthier options out there, that people know on how unhealthy these foods are in the first place? And like, obviously, I don't want to ask a question about education because that's a completely different topic, the system and everything, but...
Never a different topic.
Okay, well, I just think that the education system altogether is just a mess, and people aren't getting equally educated. So do you think it's even, like, possible to have a society that really knows and understands, like, just the dangers of what they're doing, putting in their body? Because there's bound to be, like, some populace that's just less, I guess, fortunate to have the education that we have.
Mm-hmm. That's a great point. Okay, right in front of you there.
I guess kind of another point that'll just kind of like, I guess, further complicate things or add to the discussion, I guess, is sugar. So I don't remember necessarily all the facts on this kind of thing, but kind of going back to bad science, I guess in a different area. I forget exactly what it was. I watched a documentary on it one time about the comparison, 20 or so years ago between trans fats and sugars. And, everyone, there were studies done that said, oh, trans fats are very bad for you. And trans fats are now, like, you don't find them anywhere because everyone knows that. And so they're not used anymore. But apparently similar studies have been conducted and found similar results with sugar. And the reason that nothing's done about that is because of like sugar lobbyists in the government. So again, also going back to policy making, there's no simple solution because policy is also skewed by people with other interests. So the sugar lobbyists who have a lot of money to make off of sugar and cheap food, despite its implications for public health.
Yeah, and in many ways, these three questions are actually related. I mean, it's talking about who has access and who doesn't, who's able and who isn't. How do you make change if there's this giant gulf between what you know and what you don't know, what you can afford to do and what you can't afford to do, how well you're educated or how you're not? Have you been given the tools to do these things? And so I realize these are sort of different questions, but I think they're getting at some of the same things. So now I'm going to turn it over to our panelists.
There are two barriers to effective education, and those barriers are greed and addiction. It's been said for many generations now that the world's greatest public health problem is poverty, but I would argue that it's not poverty, it's greed, and that.
Yeah, I think we can probably applaud that. Yeah.
And that when there is either an addictive behavior or an addictive substance, that causes people to ignore education. So there isn't a smoker who doesn't know that tobacco is harmful, but they're addicted to it. There's an alcoholic who doesn't know that alcohol is harming them, but whatever education you try to do about the harm of alcohol falls on deaf ears. So those are the two primary barriers, and the greed side of it is the corporate normalization of unhealthy behavior. And they are very powerful in their communication efforts to make sugar normal. It's actually more insidious than you know, because the manner in which, when the low-fat craze hit the U.S., the manner in which they decreased the fat content of foods was to add highly processed fructose. That's when the spike in highly processed fructose went up, and that's when the spike started in obesity. So not only was sugar more harmful than fats, even at that time, science could have told you that, but they substituted sugars for the fats that in order to keep people buying their products.
We deal with the impact of poverty in every single thing we do at the Cleveland Department of Public Health. What Scott said so eloquently is something that is really our reality. We also understand that a lot of science that's out there could possibly be sponsored by those greedy folks who want to make sure that the science comes out on their side so that what you're reading and what you're seeing is something that benefits that industry, and that's a huge challenge for us. We work on so many kinds of interventions to try to give people skills and education about making the right, healthier choices for themselves and their families and their children, and I don't think any of these folks intentionally want to make the wrong choice for their families and their children. But when they can buy a meal for $4 for $5.99 at Rally's, that's what they can afford, because a pound of bananas is, $1.12 or whatever it is. It's a huge issue. A single banana, I thought, at a corner store, because we were trying to do some healthy corner store activities, one banana was $1. That's a lot.
In Shaker, a bunch of bananas is $1.
And so in Shaker, right, a bunch of bananas is $1. But that could be 3 cans of soup or three servings of something for their families. So we're challenged with this every single day. We're trying to bring back community gardens. There's been a huge investment in community gardens, and just showing people where food comes from. I mean, there's just a general lack of understanding of where that comes from. Again, these kinds of messages, and trying to give people skills and education, but also access to the kinds of things that makes them feel better. But it's very expensive. We are swimming upstream every single day with every single one of these issues.
Megan?
I was just going to say, there's many artists working in our region who are straddling visual art practice and what we would call social practice, who are really invested in the communities in which they live and trying to make positive change on a lot of these issues. And I had the pleasure last Wednesday of not being in the office and being in Pittsburgh to meet with artists and get out of the melee that was happening here. And then we met with a woman named Dana Bishop Root, and she's part of 2 collectives in Braddock, Pennsylvania. Braddock is a steel town, sort of post-industrial town right outside of Pittsburgh that was truly destroyed in the post-industrial sort of trough. And since the sort of early 2000s, they got a new mayor, and a lot of artists from outside of Pittsburgh moved to Braddock to set up shop. And she's one with 2 of her collective partners who run the Carnegie Library there, basically, and have inaugurated a lot of social programs around the collection of books and art lending, and a print room where people can come and make prints and get agency to get their voices and their needs visually out of their heads and into the public. But the other collective she's part of is called General Sisters, and they are actually trying to set up a store, a corner store in Braddock that will sell mostly homegrown and homemade food through the entire cycle of the year. So you would go in, and in addition to the normal wares, you would buy seeds, and then you would plant the seeds at your home, and then you could come back. And it's a really amazing practice that they have of connecting kind of the experience of taking pleasure in the things that we eat and the things that we own and the way they look and the way that they're designed for the people who often are ignored in design, the people that don't get to participate in the kind of interesting next best things because of their poverty. And so this is happening in cities around Cleveland and in Cleveland as well. And so I do think artists have something to bring to this conversation of seeing the world a little differently, as well as addressing some of these problems in interesting ways.
Thank you, Megan. This actually gets back to the heart of why we wanted to host this here in connection with the exhibit upstairs, which is to address that gap that you were talking about. Honestly, there's not a way to address the gap. There's all the ways to address the gap. And so that's education, that's public health programs, that's top-down stuff. It's also grassroots movement, it's artist communities, it's growing vegetables for your neighbors. My neighbors, we all share, I had good tomatoes this year, here's my tomato. Well, I had good eggplants. And you just, that's something that is a next door kind of activity. And I think the point is there is a huge gap between, and we have a tendency to sometimes feel hopeless. And there's been a lot of people feeling a little bit hopeless, I think, in the last couple of weeks. But to be perfectly honest with you, we can be each other's hope. And how Cleveland rose from the ashes after the incredible blight that hit them in the 19th century and the early 20th century it didn't come from Washington. It didn't even come from the governor. It didn't come from the mayor's office. It came from public people. It came from people who were noisy, who were like, no, I don't want that here. No, I don't want that in my neighborhood. It came from people who, one of my favorite stories about public health actually has to do with polio. We are still in the record books for the most number of people vaccinated in the shortest period of time. It was like the last time Cleveland won a pennant and nobody went there because it was Sabin Oral Sundays. And so they were giving out the vaccines for free. And that meant that philanthropists and teachers and advertising agencies and media and everybody had to work together to make that happen. So when we're talking about those big gaps, I think rather than feeling disempowered, rather than feeling helpless or hopeless, it's situations like this. It's here, it's talking to each other. It's seeing each other. It's seeing art. It's listening to different sides of the debate that really actually brings us together to answer some of the problems that we face.
So if I can disagree with Brandy just slightly.
Oh, I'll let you.
There's only one way to change it. There aren't infinite ways to change things. The only one way to change things is to change social norms, but there are infinite ways to change social norms.
True.
And art is clearly one of those, and some art isn't moving in the direction of positive social change, and the more we can advocate for art that does promote social norms that are health in their orientation. The campaign that Robert Wood Johnson is pushing, called a culture of health. That's what I mean by changing social norms. The disappointment is that many people, perhaps in this room, I'm quite sure on this panel, believed that social norms were changing in a positive direction, and then an election comes along and disinvests us of that illusion. It doesn't mean that social change isn't happening in a positive direction. It means that it's going to go in the sort of graph that change always goes in. Even if it's going upward, it's going to go down and up and down and up, but ultimately upward.
Exactly. And again, but it's to be the change you want to see in the world, right? And I think in this room right now, everybody have a good look at each other. Just look at each other for a minute. Look around. Look around. This is where change comes from. So thank you for being with us, being part of our conversation, being willing to partner with us in this way. You're actually, you're just as important as the talk. You're just as important as the panel. Several of us are going to adjourn to the Happy Dog, which is not a very long walk from here. And if you like hot dogs and tater tots and beer, and you're old enough to drink beer, you can have the hot dogs though. You can join us, and please stick around, talk to each other, talk to us, talk to the people that are here, and please come back to MoCA if you didn't get a chance to see the exhibit upstairs. It's well worth seeing. And again, thank you to everybody who came tonight. Thank you, Megan. Thank you, MoCA. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, audience. Good night.
Thank you.